Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. As always, I'm accompanied here by Charles Araujo, and we're here to bring up the latest and greatest trends in enterprise tech and how they're going to affect the CIO office. One of the interesting things that came up this week, Charlie, that we've been chatting about beforehand, is this concept of an AI app layer. There was an interesting article that recently came out about how we can look at the implications of AI on business applications and what this means for the CIO office and for the IT stack. I'm curious about what you're seeing there and what you think about that.
So I read this article. It's a Business Insider article, and it's quoting a gentleman by the name of Elad Gil, and he's an
The funder,
investor.
yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but the what was really interesting about it, and I'm almost ashamed to admit this because I
Mm-hmm.
sort of hadn't thought of it this way, but the basic premise that he's sort of putting out there is that we're putting all this energy and focus on LLMs, right? These foundational models, or what he's calling foundational models, um, and that's all this emphasis, but that the real evolution, or the real, in his case, he's looking at it from money, but I look at it from a transformative perspective, is going to happen at the next layer up. So, I don't think he said this in the article, or that this is what the article said, but when I read it, the light bulb went off. It's like, oh, wait a minute, this is like these foundational layers are sort of like the new OS, and we're going to have this layer on top of it that people start doing something with it. And it's one of those things that for me was so, you know simultaneously obvious and light bulb going off, right? It's like, yeah, why haven't I not processed this? And we're already seeing it um play out. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
virtually every single company that you and I are talking to has something where they're trying to incorporate it. And I've been sort of dismissing it a little bit as a lot of hand waving, and there's
Mm-hmm.
plenty of that. There's tons and tons of that. But what this article made me sort of pause and reconsider was, for those that actually do something novel with this, what does that mean? And how is, because his whole premise is that that's where all the money's really going to be made, just like in the early days of both, the personal computer, or then the internet, that once you had the foundation laid, it was where it got really interesting, is what people built on top of it. So like, this article didn't have a lot of answers, right? But it was just really thought provoking for me, because I sort of, call me a dummy. I just hadn't gone there. So I don't know what your take on it was.
Yeah, I feel like we've been making a big deal about the models themselves, just breathlessly saying this is 7 billion parameters, this is 10 billion parameters, this is 50 billion parameters. These massively parameterized models that are getting bigger and bigger. And that's great and it is amazing and all, but to me, at the end of the day, I feel like this is like talking about relational databases or data stores or maybe code libraries. It's like these are important foundational platform pieces of what we're doing from a technology perspective, but it doesn't really get to how all of this is being used. Right now, most of us are looking at LLMs as technology where we are putting in a prompt. We type in, a 50-word request, and we get something cool out, and we say, "Hey, that was nifty and neat," and all of that. And it seems like that's just the tip of the iceberg, because that's a lot like writing a SQL query onto a database and then getting something back and saying, "Wow, that was amazing. That was so cool. I just got the first 50 rows of information back and I was able to look at it, and then the end, and then comparing that to the complexity of the entire enterprise application market, you know, ERP, CRM, all the three letters, acronyms that we see, that's the actual future of what the database ended up supporting. Like the database in and of itself was nice, but now we have, a gazillion different software markets that all do their own thing. And I think that's going to be the interesting part about generative AI, seeing how those applications start to be built out. And the other thing is that, generative AI isn't just pulling out data in and of itself, it's pulling out kind of the feelings associated with data. And I think we're still struggling to figure out what that means. once we get to there, then we can build the applications that really matter. And we're all figuring this out in real time. So there's I have a lot
I,
of those are my feelings on it, at least.
I'm sitting here and I was like rolling. I think I did it visibly, but in my head as well, because I remember, I mean, going way back my early days of the Commodore 64, and I remember I was so enthralled with this idea that I could build this little database and and then
Mm-hmm.
query it. And it was like, and it was so ridiculous, of course, because it was all the data I stuck on there. I knew what it was, but it was just this idea of like how exciting it was that it regurgitated this back. And I think you're right. I mean, I think I what for me one of the big light bulb moments of it, or not even light bulb, but like the like wow, I hadn't thought of it that way, was that I've been struggling. I think I still am struggling to imagine what that layer is going to look like. And I think that's it. That's why there's going to be so much money to be made. It's going to be those people that do figure that out, that come up with that novel idea. Because if I look at the custom GPTs that OpenAI released as an
Mm-hmm.
example, and it's like I built a few, and people are talking about, oh, they're going to monetize them, and I'm like, whatever. I mean, it's like maybe, but if they're going to be monetized, it's going to be because I'm willing to stick in a huge set of proprietary data into it that allows it to then be leveraged. And I think that's going to be the trick. I think, as we think about this from a CIO's perspective, the question is, what proprietary data do you have that when you apply this foundational layer of AI, of generative AI to it, and ideally not just generative, right? Probably predictive AI elements and other elements. When you combine all
Right.
these
Mm-hmm.
pieces, how does that sum equal more than the total equal to more than the sum of the parts? And I think those are going to be the breakthrough moments, and goes all the way back to why in the end, right? NVIDIA, I think we're going to maybe talk about them a little bit as well.
Mm-hmm.
And OpenAI, these guys are the quintessential uh, pick and shovel sellers of this gold rush, right?
Right.
And that's great, right? They're going to make tons and tons of money because they're selling those building blocks, but ultimately, the what we're going to be building on top of it is what gets built on top of it. It's what comes after that, and that's going to all be driven by this whatever proprietary data that you as an organization can pull together, mix and match, and imagine what happens when you do that. And I think to your point, it's not going to be just sticking it in front of a chat GPT interface and let people query it. It's going to be, how do I construct value out of that? And I don't know that I'm smart enough to figure out what that is, but I think certainly if I was in an enterprise today, that's the head scratching I'd be doing to figure out what AI app layers can I build. Because you're probably not going to have the resources to go and be an OpenAI. In fact, you're not going to have those
Mm-hmm.
resources, but you do have the resources to build something at this AI app layer that could be transformative. And first mover advantage, I think, is still very much there as we start thinking about that.
Yeah, but with these models, where I get excited is really around when people started talking about retrieval augmented generation, fine tuning, adding your business rules to the platform or to the LLM in this case. That's the part that gets me really interested, because I feel like the large language model in and of itself, it's like saying, I have the Oxford English Dictionary. Therefore, it has every word ever created. Therefore, I have every idea ever created. It's like, well, that's kind of true, but making every idea is a little bit more complex than simply having all the hundreds of thousands of words of the English language at your fingertips. And I think that's the imaginative part, and I can kind of already imagine how things like employee experience, customer experience, sales experience, like some of these more nebulous aspects of feeling and sentiment could be looked at from a generative perspective to at least say, here's what the average person has previously said about this experience or that experience. Maybe this will be uh, the the that tech tool that finally gets companies to realize that, for instance, phone trees are awful, and nobody wants to wait 4 minutes before talking to an actual person by punching in the buttons and saying 1 6 3 over and over and over again. Just being able to understand feelings like that in real time based on the text and what you're actually saying, because actually voice to text is pretty good at this point. When we say something, the phone or whatever knows what we're saying. they know the word. It's like 90% accuracy, good enough to figure out what to do next. It's just a matter of what should actually happen next. That is the question, because right now what is happening is not good.
Yeah, and I do think that's what's interesting is I think that, and this is why I'm becoming more and more convinced that the answer is really going to be how all of these pieces get mixed and matched together, because, and I think ironically, it's going to actually eventually, I'm not sure what our time frame is, it's going to bring us back to really where the conversation that we've been having about AI for the last several years really was rooted to begin with, and that was this idea of, and I don't really like this term, but it's the only one I have. If we make a separation between generative and predictive, whatever, the other forms of AI that are basically saying, hey, can I intuit what your sentiment is, or can I understand and predict based on your past behavior what it is that may be important to you, or maybe even why you're calling to begin with, or that I should be calling you proactively and doing this, and then using generative AI as part of the layer that allows it to communicate more effectively, which has always been the gap, right? To be able to actually understand and process. So I think it's going to be putting all these pieces together and rooted in that proprietary data, whether that's business rules, whether that's a treasure trove of customer data I have, so probably a mix of all of it. I think that's what's going to be really, really interesting. And I think it's almost going to require us to undo so much of what we've historically trained our organizations to do within the enterprise, because we've always been structured on this, or focused on the structured data, on this, like, we need to have everything kind of figured out. And now sort of say, okay, if we could throw all that away, throw everything you knew away, and say, if we could imagine this experience to be exactly the way we wanted, magic happens, what would that look like? And I think that is almost going to be a more instructive and a more useful approach, because I think some of the rules that we've operated under are going to inhibit us, in that imagination that's required to kind of go to what's going to come next.
Right. In the 20 plus years I've been in data, there's always been a relational database. If you're advanced, you do predictive analytics, and that leads to some sort of forecast or some sort of predicted outcome. But usually that's a singular outcome at the end of the day. And that's kind of a problem, actually, because we should be thinking about portfolios of potential opportunities, the variance that occurs, kind of the open-ended circumstances that define the real world. And that's something that we're getting one step towards with generative AI, that it gives us an answer that isn't, what is the answer 6? Well, instead it says, what is the answer? Well, here's what I've seen based on the entirety of text on the internet. People tend to feel like this and that, and provide some sort of context. And that's still only context for one point of view, but it still provides a type of context that is different, fundamentally different from the very prescriptive and specific data answers that we're used to getting as techies.
So I think what's interesting about this whole conversation is that I think there's this interesting juxtaposition about another piece of news that broke today. And that is about Broadcom spinning off one of the very first components of its VMware acquisition. And I say juxtaposition because it's part of a long history within the enterprise tech world of these business units that reach a point of stability. They are embedded into everything, and can't dislodge them, and it creates this really interesting dynamic. And it's not an area that I follow all that closely, but I do think it's fascinating to see some of the hand wringing going on. And so I'm curious what your take is on both. I think broadly, the VMware acquisition, the spinoff. I mean, there's some other moves that Broadcom has been making recently. And what do you think that all means, especially, in the midst of all these conversations we've been having about, AI everything? Here's this very, bread and butter type technology. How do you see that part playing out?
Well, it's been really interesting to see how this whole Broadcom VMware thing is going in the first place. First Broadcom bought the whole kit and caboodle for 60 some billion dollars. I forget the exact number, but that's a lot of money, more than I have. And immediately they started doing a bunch of things to optimize very quickly. Going back to the optimization thing, they completely tore apart their partner system. They basically canceled all their partners and said, we're going to create an entirely new partner program focused just on kind of our top 2,000 partners, and everybody else, whatever. Also, from a licensing perspective, they took all of their permanent license holders and said, we're not going to provide support to you anymore. So if you want support, you've got to move over to our subscription licensing. Obviously, they are trying to get more money. They have to get their $60 billion back. But another thing they've done is they're saying our core business is virtualization at the end of the day. It is impossible to be in IT without knowing what a virtual machine is. At this point, it is something we all have to deal with, no matter what kind of app or what kind of networking or what kind of cloud computing or whatever you do in IT. The virtual machines that you're dealing with in your organization are that virtualization strategy has to be a part of whatever you're considering, whatever you're trying to modernize. So now Broadcom is trying to optimize there as well. They're trying to consolidate their business, and they've actually just sold off their end user computing unit. They sold it off for about $4 billion to KKR. KKR has also bought BMC. They've also bought Cloudera. They have a number of IT companies, tech companies already in their portfolio, and now they're going to add this end user computing, call it end user mobile management, laptop management, thing management capability to their portfolio. And I'm actually excited about it because I think that the VMware end user computing unit has kind of been frozen for the last couple of years. It was a piece of the puzzle for VMware to get more virtualization business, but it, as a standalone, it was really kind of ignoring the next steps of kind of what you would expect a company to do strategically. So if you're supporting end user computing, would you stop at the phone, or would you want to support, say, apps, or look at app performance, or APIs, or all of these other things that are the end user experience? Obviously, you would want to take that next step forward, and VMware couldn't do that while they were being purchased, and while this was honestly kind of a side business for them. So now that it's actually standalone business again, I'm interested in seeing what could happen next. So so that's kind of what I'm seeing in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think it'll be very interesting to see if it remains a standalone unit within KKR. I doubt it. I expect it's going to get rolled into something. To your point, I think the end user computing it is a piece of the puzzle for any organization, and in my opinion, it belongs as part of a suite. Having it as a standalone solution, particularly one that is not horribly innovative, I think is not probably a good recipe. So we'll see what it does. I mean, I think as an investment firm, they've done some really smart things. So I think that bodes well for it. I also agree with you insofar as that it was never, in my opinion, a very good fit for VMware. I do think that it's interesting to see how Broadcom is playing that out, at least from what we can see from the outside looking in. I think it's smart from probably a financial perspective, right? That's what this was. This was a financial acquisition. I'm not all that convinced that this isn't just a long march, right? I mean, part of the whole reason that this is happening is that virtualization is unquestionably moving to the cloud. I don't, I'm not necessarily sure about this either. There's been a lot of, noise about, this is going to be really good for Nutanix. It's going to push people to, finally abandon VMware and move to private cloud solutions like Nutanix or others. I think there's so much inertia, so much investment in this that, it's why a company like Broadcom can do this, right? Because the reality is they can take some pretty dramatic actions, and people are going to swallow it because this is all critical, but it's not, no one's talking to me about their strategic agenda and where VMware is really playing in that today, right? I mean, that's not the conversation that people are having for the most part. It's the bread and butter, the stuff that has to happen. It's there, it's important, it's critical. But if I only have so many strategic bets to make, and right now making a shift off VMware just probably isn't one of them. And so, it's a whole lot of heartache, and there better be a good reason for it. And so, what I'm challenged by, right? My focus is always on digital transformation and really
Mhm.
how organizations are building a capability that enables them to do that. And what I struggle with is how, leaving aside the business aspects of it for Broadcom, how any of this leads to really solid outcomes for a VMware client, right? That this somehow puts them in a better position, that they're going to be able to be more transformative or be more competitive or be able to move fast in the marketplace. I don't think any of those things are true. And I think this is just going to become a cost of doing business. And I think in the end that's not a great thing. I think organizations need to be making these very strategic bets and looking to partner with organizations that are part of that strategic transformative action. And look, I guess at the end of the day, that's just not Broadcom's model, and so be it. But that's that. I actually felt like there was a potential for VMware to transform itself and to become relevant again in this space, and I'm not sure that's going to be the case now.
Yeah, it was frustrating to watch that VMware for a while was trying to modernize itself, and then once Broadcom came in, that was the end. And now we see a cash cow. Now we're gonna see basically what would happen to Oracle if you just divested the Oracle database from everything else and pushed that as a cash cow. Like that's basically what we've got. One of these foundational IT technologies, something that every CIO has some sort of strategy for. But I shouldn't really say strategy, more like a tactic or a line item and some sort of operational
Right.
support for. That's really what it is. And then seeing how embedded is this, that and how unwilling are people to get rid of it. That it's kind of a contest at this point.
Yeah, well, and I do think the risk. It's funny. I just finished drafting an article about the role of power systems, IBM power systems, in modernization.
Mhm.
And if I compare and contrast the two, what I think is different is that you can say what you want about IBM power systems, but they are rock solid tanks built
Mhm.
for expressly built for these mission critical workloads. And so this whole article is about the fact that if you're trying to modernize those into a traditional public cloud type environment, you got a lot of things you have to deal with because the cloud is built for a completely different use case. It's all about scalability and speed, and as far as speed of change and what have you. And so there's a real challenge. I think if I look and compare migrating VMware workloads into public cloud, that barrier entry is much, much lower. And so I think the risk that Broadcom has with this is they need to be careful not to overplay their hand, right?
Mhm.
There's not that same. I mean, the entrenchment is the inertia, the fact that I have so much, an organization has so much investment in both hardware and the software and the capabilities around it. But the barrier to move those workloads is much, much lower, whether that's to a Nutanix or into the public cloud. And so if they overplay their hand too much, then suddenly it does rise to that level where a CIO goes, you know what, I've had enough, and this isn't worth playing anymore, and I'm going to make this change. And so I think that's the kind of interesting difference, and we'll see how this goes.
Yeah, I think that we're going to see a lot of reconsideration to uh, is it reverse repatriation if you're going like into the cloud? It's like what are we going
Exactly.
to call that? Yes, but basically, this real demand to modernize workloads that seems to have been steadily supported on virtualization for a long time. Now you have to rethink that thing that you hadn't even thought about for the last 15 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So, along those lines, I am just curious. I think we have a few more minutes here. Again, kind of bouncing back and forth to the ultra new and
Mm-hmm.
ultra hot, whatever. And I'm curious what you're making of the whole NVIDIA earnings report recently. And again, I look at it from a CIO perspective, and I've been sitting here asking myself if I was sitting in the CIOs today, like, does any of this matter to me? I'm curious what your take on it is.
Yeah, so obviously they're making a huge amount of money selling GPUs to the data center. Obviously, and that is what's pushing their earnings and their stock price. And now everybody at NVIDIA is about to buy a house in the Bay Area and jack up the prices even more. Fantastic, good for you. Always happy when other people are successful. But the part that I actually found interesting about the NVIDIA earnings is kind of behind the scenes. If you look at all of the other categories that they've been also increasing sales over the past few quarters, and those workloads are supporting, I would call, more traditional use cases, not necessarily generative AI. They are supporting gaming usage. They're using looking at cars. They're looking at transportation. They're looking at other business use cases associated with the cloud and with logistics and with digital entertainment that and media that have been around for a while. I see that as a proxy for cloud spend and trying to figure out what's actually happening with cloud spend at this point. Is it growing? Is it staying steady? Is because you need those foundational chips to be able to support the cloud going forward. So the fact that NVIDIA is also seeing growth not at that explosive GPU level, but that they're doing for generative AI, but for everything else, that they're seeing kind of steady growth in those areas as well, I think is an interesting sign for cloud cost spend as well. That it has kind of gotten back to the level it was a couple of years ago. But the fact that this quarter's spend was very similar to last quarter seems to be showing that it's kind of evening out. So I find that as an interesting precursor trend in cloud to to the rest of the cloud spend.
Well, so I think we're in this really interesting period because I think we're in a period of normalization around the cloud in general. Certainly, when I talk to executives, interestingly enough, I'm hearing fewer and fewer talk about cloud first, and more talking about and even like cloud native is still, except for the very largest companies, it's still pretty early days around that sort of development. Where a lot of like SaaS first, which I thought it was fascinating, almost this other end of the spectrum. And so I think we're in this normalization where people, I've been a believer that we're in a hybrid IT world and will be for decades into the future, where we're going to have this wild mix. And it's always going to just come down to some of these same conversations like we just had about VMware, about does it make sense financially and from a strategic perspective to invest my very limited resources in getting off this platform? And in many, many cases, the answer is no. And so we're going to have these legacy architectures around for a very, very long time. And so I think we're in this normalization period. But I think what is embedded in some of those numbers you're talking about is the complexity of our workloads across the board, regardless of the platform they're sitting on. The complexity of the workloads are growing exponentially. What we're asking our systems to do with I've been focusing a lot recently on kind of the re-emergence of process automation as like the sort of holy grail that we're really now taking a fresh look and stuff that we literally couldn't automate just a few years ago. Combination of AI and combination of new technology and frankly chip capability where we have enough processing power to actually do this stuff. It's like everything's on the table again. And so I think we're seeing this evolution of the complexity of the processes and the level of automation, the level of integration that we're seeing. And I'm sure that's part of what's driving what you're talking about, coupled with the Gen AI and all the AI workloads, which are just highly intensive. And yet I think we're going to continue to see this normalization. I know that, I think you pointed out an article where some of the cloud providers are saying, hey, the cloud optimization era is over. It's like, I don't believe that for a second, but it may not reflect in their numbers because of what we're just talking about, right? There's going to be this whole rationalization where some of these more complex workloads are going to drive increased cost, but it's going to be balanced out against people are saying, I don't need to run that in the cloud and I can actually run this in other ways. So I think it's this really interesting period we're in where the traditional sort of metrics and ways that we looked at it are just going to get turned upside down.
Yeah, at Amalgam Insights, we talk about the IT rule of 30, basically saying every unmanaged IT spend category averages 30% in waste. But that's in a variety of areas. There's duplicate resources, there's zero usage resources, there's better contracting, there's better product choices, moving to more efficient data stores or buying pipeline in greater scale or something like that. And then finally going to repatriation or different vendor and all of those play a piece of the puzzle. And recently, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft have all said we think that this whole cost optimization phase is over. And I think what they're seeing is that just that first part of duplicate resources and zero use resources are getting cleaned up. Like people finally figured out they had all this stuff switched on that they just needed to turn off, and they did that easy part. And I think the vendors are saying, okay, the end. You got me. You caught on and you found all that extra stuff that was on. But I think that companies are still going to take those next few steps and figure out, okay, now that we've done that, what can we do with reserved instances to improve our costs? What can we do to move to lower tier storage or less performance storage for the stuff that we don't really need as to be analytic in nature or predictive or AI based in nature. It doesn't have to be live data. Why should I put it on this live database? So there's going to be a lot more consideration around what is appropriate there. And I think the vendors, cloud vendors, are starting to find out for the first time what it's like to actually be an IT vendor, because if you're Oracle or SAP, you have had this level of scrutiny placed on you for a long time, or Microsoft on the traditional software side. But now all the cloud vendors who for years have seen 50% growth and just have taken it for granted that people will just give them money hand over fist are now having to figure out, oh, this is what it means to be an actual grown up in the IT world.
Oh. I think it's dead on. I think that's exactly where this is landing. I think you nailed it. And I think it's going to be this really interesting period that we are in where I think we're gonna live this really strange world where all this hyperbole is actually going to be true, right? I mean, I don't know if it's going to be $7 trillion that Altman is saying he needs for chips, and I heard that was a false number, but whatever. These crazy ass numbers, I think those are going to be true, while at the same time what you just said is true, right? That these two realities are going to live simultaneously, and they're going to create a lot of confusion because they feel like they don't match. And yet they do. We're in this period where we're going to see this crazy growth, explosive changes, and yet we're going to be in this period of rationalization where people are trying to sort this out, optimize, bring things under control to create space for whatever next is coming, to create the new layer of AI apps that they have to create value, or all these pieces are going to mix together. So I think it's this is our new reality, and it will be for a while.
Yeah. Just a quick note on that $7 trillion that Sam Altman's asking for. I think it's, I think at some point, like some sort of game playing happens in Silicon Valley where you just say, well, this person asked for $70 billion. I'm just going to ask, for 100 times as much and show that I'm 100 times bigger, influencer and thought leader and, revolutionary than everybody else. And at some point you have to figure out, well, there isn't that much money in the world, so how do we actually get there? No country is going to literally bankrupt themselves to fund your vision.
that number of zeros is definitely above my pay grade, so I just take it all with one big grain of salt and say, okay, we'll see where this goes.
Exactly. But talking about the world changing, another interesting article this week we saw was from The Verge, talking about robots, robot techs, and how we've actually been very dependent on looking at the web as a technology that is, call it family friendly, that people were basically trying to do the right thing and trying to talk to each other and trying to share information in a way that would be mutually beneficial for all parties. But with the launch of generative AI, especially, I think people are starting to see this becoming a more one-sided relationship, and then finding that there are fewer and fewer ways to actually prevent being exploited, for lack of a better word. So, thinking about that, how does that change our world of the web? Like, we've been talking about how we use all these SaaS applications running basically on the web. Our access of every social media network, every basically every service we use, has some sort of internet component to it, some sort of, a lot of them are web based. So, what's this mean for our digital world and for what we should be thinking from a digital transformation perspective?
So, I read this article. It was in the Verge, right? And I took two big things away from it. The first was, I think, as the CIO, it's something you need to be paying attention to, because the reality is that the LMs will be traversing your sites, your publicly facing sites, and maybe some of your not publicly facing sites, and they're going to be scraping the state, and you need to think about, do you care? Does that matter to you or not?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is relevance to every CIO out there, where something that, well, to be honest, there may be CIOs who don't even know what the robot.txt file is, right? It's just this simple text file that communicates in a non-binding way to a crawler whether or not you should crawl or under what guidelines. And it was, that you said, this sort of community honor system that has existed for 30 years, since the very early days. And 40 years, I'm getting old. Anyway, however long it's been. And so suddenly this whole thing has changed. Now, my second reaction, though, was that this is a bunch of ado about nothing, because the on the one hand, you sit here and say, well, these guys have, scraped all of this stuff and used it to build their models. But I look at it and say, well, that it's not much different than the way that the search engines first did it to index everything, especially Google in particular. Right? Google was the one that
Right.
really revolutionized the whole idea of the crawler. Um, and and yes, they used it to provide links back in the early days, but increasingly they've been trying to display information directly in the search results. And let's call a spade a spade. They're doing it because you and I, as consumers of that, we want that. And I use ChatGPT for search all the time because it's faster, because it's more. I don't have to try to guess keywords to put into a Google search bar. I just ask it what the heck I'm trying to come up with. And here's the key: I tell it to cite me sources, give me links, and I go and click those links to then go read to make sure it's not hallucinating and to make sure I understand the rest of the context. So if I look at it from that perspective, I'm not sure that it's any different. And I'm not sure that I look at this and go, oh my gosh, there. And the reality is, at least as long as people like Microsoft make, their version, I forgot what's called now, right? But their version available through Bing, and OpenAI has a free layer, and Google makes it available free through Bard. How is it any different? It is still, the society is, as a rule, is still benefiting from it. So on the one hand, I look and go, I'm not sure I'm making as big, I have the same reaction that others do to it. On the other hand, though, if I'm a CIO today, it's like, I need to think about it, because at the very least, I can't just be passive. I need to be deliberate with whether or not I'm going to react and respond to this, and if so, how I'm going to do that. So it was this kind of, I had this dualistic kind of view.
Yeah, my biggest concern is pretty tactical, and it's around copyrighted intellectual property and the ability to use it. We have given Google pretty much a free pass on our IP, trusting that it will only use it from a fair use perspective or from a quoted perspective. And actually, they've built a lot of services where they are careful about that. When you look at Google Books, for instance, it only gives you a couple of pages unless you pay for the book or get access in some way. They at least think about the service, think about it in this way. Whereas something like generative AI scraper, I at least I assume it just takes all of that text. It takes there's no person who decides whether this is sensitive or not. You're just going to take the entire thing and you're going to use it to feed your model. The end of story. Your labor and your IP is used. The end. And at least I personally feel that's a little one-sided. From a practical perspective, I think you're right, Charlie, that at the end of the day, like, the average person doesn't care because they want the convenience. But at the same time, I think this is going, at the very least, I think companies have to take another look at the compliance and the governance associated with any sort of data that might be accessible to the outside world, and the extent to which that data is protected. Robots.txt has traditionally been a way to do that on the web, and I think that is a less trustable way to do it now. I think anything that is, uh, you used to be able to say, I don't want this tracked by Google, or I don't want this to be part of Google Analytics for whatever reason, and you could trust that Google would do that. So even if you trust OpenAI to not do it, their OpenAI is going to have other competitors, and right now we see Anthropic. Cohere probably won't because they are EU standard LLM, and their entire thing is being following the European Union standards. But somebody else is going to come along. I don't think that people are suddenly going to give up on trying to scrape data and create other models.
Yeah, and I think that's my issue. The toothpaste is out of the tube at this point. I mean, I think, because the reality is we're going to have open sourced LLMs that people can run on their own machines or on VMs or whatever, and they're not going to adhere to any rules anyway. So I do think, as as an enterprise executive, I think you need to be thinking about it and just processing it and acting deliberately here, knowing that this is what's happening and that your data is going to be subject. It probably already has been. So again, it's the cat's sort of out of the bag on it. So I'm not sure how much there is to even do about it. But if I can get philosophical for a minute, I look at this, and maybe the reason that I don't have a problem with it is it's the exact same thing I do, right? How do I learn? I go read your stuff and I digest it and I go, oh, that's really interesting. And the ideas that I think are really interesting, I pull and I make them part of my canon of knowledge and I apply them. And when I then am writing something, there's a good chance that I'm taking stuff that you've said and it's impacted the way I think. And if I look at this from I don't know if we're ever going to get to AGI, artificial general intelligence, or not, but as the closer we get to that, what I expect my AI to be is a very smart companion that actually can reason about all this stuff, and that means they need to be educated on all these things, which means they need to read all the smart stuff that you write and all the smart stuff that a lot of other people write, and they have to take that in, and that's fundamentally what this process is. And so when I look at fair use, to me, the safeguards are, hey, it better not be just regurgitating out what you already wrote and claiming it to be original, right? That's the big thing. It has to be going through this process. And so I think it's going to be incumbent on these firms to put in those sort of safeguards that is not plagiarizing. But the process of internalizing it and using that as the foundation of the model, I think that's what we ultimately need it to do, because we need it to be trained on all of this compendium of wisdom and knowledge that we have.
It's interesting that you've already skipped to, okay, when AGI happens, I just want it to be smart and somebody that I can talk to. You kind of, most people are still debating whether it's going to happen or not. You're there.
No, I'm debating. I'm debating if it's going to happen, but and I'm not convinced that it actually will in the true sense that, I mean, there's varying definitions of AGI, but I think what is unquestionable is we're going to have something that feels a lot like it. I mean, we're getting close to feeling like it now. Where we can have a conversation and it is verbose and knowledgeable about this massive range of subjects. And I mean, I routinely turn to ChatGPT to just sort of bounce ideas and to check myself and to I mean, it is amazing from that standpoint. So I don't know whether or not we're actually going to get to AGI, but we're certainly going to get a whole lot closer, and it's going to feel a whole lot closer. And I want to avoid a hallucination. Can't say the dang word now. Hallucinations. Did I say it right? I want it to have good information, and so I think it's if I land in this whole fair use thing, to me, it's like it is in our collective interest for all that information to be in there. It's about then how do we put some guardrails around it. So and look at I'm a content creator, so I'm as subject to this as anybody else. All of my content is out there, but one of the trade-offs is I can go and tell it to write something in my voice or give me an argument that I might make, and it does a pretty good job. And so to me, I think it's about how we extract value out of it and to recognize where that value is going to come from in the future. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot of things that I have opinions on that we don't have time for today, about hallucinations and the nature of AGI and how AI compares to neural behavior and activity. But we'll say that for another week. For now, I think we've done a great job of looking at the world of the CIO and what they should be looking at. And I'm looking forward to covering this, seeing what happens in the week ahead and chatting with you next week about this.
Sounds great.
All right. Take care.